Martin Durkin, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Tony.
Now, are you seriously arguing that no government needs to take action to rein in CO2 emissions? The international effort to create a new global agreement on CO2 emissions is a waste of time?
Broadly speaking, yes. I mean, I'm certainly arguing that the evidence is such that we shouldn't take the theory of man-made global warming as proven to be true.
So the US government, the British government, the governments of Canada and Australia, most of the EU governments and their scientific advisors, they're all just wrong and in the thrall of some kind of swindle, is that right?
Yes.
By swindle, are you implying a conscious fraud?
I think there's an element of fraud in the debate, which is that the science is overwhelming. It's done and dusted. We now know for sure this is going on. On the contrary, there is an awful lot of, some of the most basic bits of evidence that you would look to establish the truth of man-made global warming are simply not there.
One of the central arguments in your documentary is about whether or not carbon dioxide levels can cause climate change. Here's what you say.
CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
Now, are you actually claiming there that because CO2 is such a small proportion of the atmosphere, that it can't be a climate-forcing agent?
Well, it certainly doesn't mean that it's completely obvious that it should be a climate-forcing agent.
You're not saying that it isn't a climate-forcing agent?
Well, no. I mean, CO2 is a greenhouse gas and, does affect us as other greenhouse gases do. But it's a very small greenhouse gas, and greenhouse gases themselves only form a relatively small part of the Earth's climate system.
Here's how climatologists we spoke to responded to that.
This idea that the amount of something is proportional to how important it is clearly silly. For instance, if I injected you with a little Ebola virus, that's a tiny, tiny amount of something, but it would have an immense impact on you, and you would die. So the amount of something is not in any way proportional to how big an impact it might have, and carbon dioxide's the same.
I mean, the ozone is far less of a concentration in the atmosphere than CO2, but we know the effects of increased UV.
Are you saying they're simply wrong?
Well, if you look closely at even what all climatologists, even on the side of those people who believe in global warming, say, they all admit that the existence of CO2 in the atmosphere is such a the CO2 in the atmosphere is such a small proportion that there need to be some amplifying effect for this small amount of CO2 to have the effects that are being claimed for it.
But the scientists that we spoke to look at this very differently.
The natural sources of carbon dioxide through the breathing of the planet is many, many times the amount of carbon dioxide that human activity produces. But over billions of years, the planet has developed its own mechanisms for taking back up from the atmosphere that amount of carbon dioxide. So there's a natural balance between the breathing in and the breathing out of the planet. What we've done is change that natural balance. By adding significant amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, we have upset that natural balance such that we can now observe billions of tons of carbon dioxide accumulating in the atmosphere that we can prove is the result of human activity.
So what do you say to that argument put forward by Andy Pittman and others?
I think it's absolute rubbish. I mean, the number of people who argue that there's some kind of natural equilibrium in the atmosphere and the Earth's climate, it is one of the most absurd ideas, and it's propagated by a lot of people who really ought to know better.
Here's another contentious claim in your film. Again, it's based on the historical record. You claim that the period between the 9th and the 13th centuries was hotter than today. Let's look at that.
Before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era, when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
Now, do you still stand by that claim?
Yes.
Here's what our climatologists said about that.
When I saw this picture, which shows the medieval warm period warmer than now, and the right-hand side says now, this picture's 20 years old. All the data since then has come off the top.
There is little doubt that the last 5 or 7 years has been warmer than any time in the medieval warm period, and that's what we're absolutely certain about.
So to show a graph that's 20 years out of date, not to show what happened at the end, not to report the reports, that's just a lie.
So the question is, why didn't you use the latest or even the recent IPCC charts?
Because the IPCC charts that they'd like me to use aren't reliable. The reason why we used that was that it was a very famous graph produced by Herbert Lamb, who's
What year was that?
Early 90s, I think.
Why did you use a graph that was 17 years old when you could have used more modern data which shows what's happened in that past 17 years?
Well, firstly, if you look at what's happened in the past 17 years, you don't find a huge change. I mean, we've got to get this thing in perspective. When we're talking about temperature change in the past... No, hold on. Then when you're talking about the temperature change in the past 150 years, you're talking about a temperature change of just over ½ degree Celsius in a very noisy record where the error bars are very considerable. So when you talk about temperature change in the past 20 years, you're talking, in terms of our knowledge of the climate history of the last 1,000 years, of a very tiny amount of change. I'd love to...
We have a very accurate knowledge of it because the instruments are almost perfect. We know exactly what temperature rises there have been in the past 17 years.
That's very untrue. We don't have a very accurate knowledge of it at all. We had a huge problem at the end of the Soviet Union that they closed a lot of their temperature reading stations.
17 years ago we had an accurate knowledge and now we don't. Well, I have a very simple question about your use of this graph because it says it's a chart of the temperature over 1,000 years right up to now. Now, to me, means 2007. But in fact, this graph doesn't go anywhere near 2007, does it?
Well, I mean, you can't just get a graph that's produced by Herbert Lamb on the various statistics and then add another bit of line to it.
I just want to get you to answer this question, why you said now when it isn't now.
Well, that's what the IPCC does. It refers to, years before now. I mean, in terms
goes
of...
up to, what, 90?
In terms of
90.
In terms of the error bars of that graph, it is absurd to quibble on the when it finishes in terms of tens of dates.
Well, it's not absurd because the 1990 graph, IPCC 1990 graph you used was superseded in the second IPCC report in 1995, in the third in 2001, in the fourth in 2007. Why didn't you use one of those?
I'll tell you exactly why we didn't use one of those. They were superseded by graphs which eliminated the medieval warm period. If you look at the old picture of the last 1,000 years, there's the medieval warm period, it goes down to the Little Ice Age and then up again. I'm trying to do that backwards so that people can understand. What it was replaced with was something which became known as the hockey stick, because it looks like a hockey stick, because it goes trundling along the bottom and then comes up in a manner which looks more alarming than if it just sort of dips and then comes up again.
It is alarming because it shows a rapid rise in temperature from 1990 to 2007.
Which is why scientists then looked at the hockey stick to see, because it contradicted every other sort of set of data we had for the last 1,000 years.
By saying now in the graph, you've left yourself open to the charge that you've deliberately misrepresented the graph and that you've left out 17 years of growing temperatures which don't prove your point.
But this is what they do. They'll fix on something which is a moot point. Personally, I still think it's perfectly legitimate to refer to the late 20th century as now, just as the IPCC did.
But they are hotter than the medieval warming period.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are, according to the graphs.
According to the hockey stick they are, but the hockey stick is greatly mistaken.
Let's continue, because your film answers the question, or tries to answer the question, why is it getting hotter, with the theory that it's in fact the sun that causes global warming.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to 1940, fell back for almost 4 decades, and then started to rise again.
Once again, we asked our climatologists to have a look at this section of the film and to comment on it.
They stop the record because they don't mention it falls when the temperature continues, so it's classic. Pick the section of the record that fits your preconception and then leave out the inconvenient parts.
The graph conveniently stops at 1980, when the temperature starts to rise much more rapidly and the solar activity decreases, the opposite of what they claim.
Why didn't you just continue that graph on to the present day? Because there are graphs available which do that.
Well, firstly, the graph that we were using was created by Professor Friis Christensen from the Danish Space Agency. So it would have been completely... I can't remember off the top of my head.
25 years ago.
Yeah, and it was in a period where a part of the program where we're talking about, it was a historical part of the program where we're talking about key discoveries in the history of, recent history of climatology.
Shall I tell you what happens after 1980? The temperature continues to rise very sharply. Solar activity falls off in the other direction. Now, that would have been very hard to explain in your film, wouldn't it, if you'd actually used the modern data?
Well, I mean, the graph that we used from Friis Christensen was the graph that he published in a very famous paper that sort of came out and was in part of the program that we were talking about, the history of people's understanding of what the solar effects might have been on the temperature of the 20th century.
The section, as you say, is based on his work, but when he and his colleagues saw your graphs and the way in which you'd use them in the program, they felt compelled to correct you. They wrote this, that their latest studies had explicitly concluded that after 1985, temperature continued to rise, just as I said, while the sunspot cycle length flattened out and thus no longer correlated with surface temperature. And they went on to say this point was not included in the narrator's statement.
But the point is, we've been inundated so much by the argument that CO2 is driving temperature change in the 20th century. But what very few people are ever told, that there is an extraordinary correlation between solar activity and CO2 for large parts of the 20th century. Now, why aren't we told that? There is not a very strong correlation between CO2 and temperature of the 20th century. There is a strong correlation between solar activity in the 20th century.
Why weren't we told? Why weren't we, the audience, entitled to know that the data for temperature and solar activity diverges sharply
because
after that period?
It's a very moot point. What happens after that period?
Well, not according to the Danish scientists, it isn't.
Oh, well, according to many other climatologists, it's a very moot point what happens after that.
The story of the graphs gets even more interesting in a way, because in the original version of the swindle, you had another of the Danish graphs, which they say contained false data. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, we had they've got a graph that has 400 years of temperature change and 400 years of solar activity, and there was a gap on a very small gap at one section in I think it's either solar activity or temperature, one or the other, and our graphics guy very helpfully joined it up, which was very embarrassing, and we've now corrected it for subsequent versions.
How many versions of the swindle have you actually put out since the complaints started to come through?
Oh, I mean, I do have to ask Channel 4 that. I don't know. I mean, we've got an international version.
I've counted at least 4, which have slight or major differences in them.
Oh, no, we immediately made the changes that we could straight away before we could get other graphs done. And then for subsequent ones, we've had graphs redone and to correct the errors that were pointed out. But, I mean, the thing is, the basic argument isn't changed by
why were there so many errors in the beginning? This is the strange thing.
Oh, because, it took us 6 weeks to get this thing edited. I had 3 edit suites going at the same time, and the graphics arrived a day before the program went out. And so, you know what the nature of television is. We put the program out. We hope that it's right.
Well, with 4 different versions, you could make the case that the documentary itself is as changeable as the weather.
Ah, what a neat line. We're quite happy to go out and be very pugilistic and debate the science with anyone who's prepared to do it. I mean, the thing that makes me slightly sad... Oh, I can't do that, can I? The thing that makes me slightly sad is that, there is this aggressiveness to anyone who comes up and says, look, the science doesn't necessarily stack up. Look at the evidence here.
Let's move on. One key absence from the Australian version is Carl Wunz, the professor of physical oceanography at MIT. Were you forced to remove him under threat of legal action?
No, we weren't at all.
This is what he told the Independent.
Exactly
this is what he told the Independent. They misrepresented me. My views were distorted by the context in which they placed them. I am the one who's been swindled.
Yeah, and very serious allegations indeed. And subsequently, we sent to Channel 4 all the correspondence we'd had with Carl Wunsch and the full transcript of the interview and tapes of the full interview with Carl Wunsch. And Channel 4 decided that we clearly had not misrepresented him.
Well, I mean, he says...
Very sad. I know what he says.
Hang on, this is what he says. Professor Wunsch says he would never have agreed to take part in the program if he'd known it would argue that man-made global warming was not a serious threat. Did you never consider that he'd protest being included in a polemic against his basic scientific beliefs?
If you look at the full transcript of the interview with Carl Wunsch, we represent perfectly honestly and properly what he said. I remember getting the call immediately after the programme went out from Professor Wunsch, where he said, "My God, I've just had several scientists on the phone berating me, absolutely attacking me for being in this programme. This is absolutely awful. Can you take me out? Can you take me out?" And if he wants to back out now and make this excuse, well, I suppose that's up to him.
Martin Durkin, we thank you for agreeing to go under the microscope and talk about pros and cons of this documentary and flaws and try and explain them.
No flaws, no flaws, no flaws.
No flaws, no flaws, no flaws. Well, that's Martin Durkin's view, perhaps somewhat tongue-in-cheek under the circumstances. But at the very least, the question just how deeply flawed is the Great Global Warming Swindle is a matter of public debate. Since free speech and discussion is, after all, fundamental in our democracy, we see no reason not to continue that debate openly rather than let it just fester in dark corners of the internet where bloggers will argue this is the sort of thing they're not allowed to talk about on the mainstream media. Beyond that, it's the nature of science to take on board scepticism and to answer it with rational argument. Well, our expert panel has been waiting patiently for their chance to comment, so let's hear from them now. And I'll start with Robin Williams. You've been presenting the Science Show for 32 years. Martin Durkin says his film is free of flaws. What do you think?
I think it was outrageous, and I'd like to congratulate you on being a fantastic science reporter. I think it's outrageous for two reasons. One of them is that he opened by saying, "You are being told lies." Now, all those thousands of scientists, the Scripps Institution, 1,100 scientists, where they started this CO2 work 51 years ago, the people in Tasmania, the CSIRO A team, dozens of them, the people at the Cambridge Antarctic Survey. I mean, on and on it goes. All these scientists telling lies in some vast conspiracy. Well, it's extraordinary. The way it actually works in science, you've got to imagine, if you see that film, you imagine there's a sort of chorus line. There's a cheer squad of thousands of scientists looking at a couple of computer models. What in fact happens, because scientists are so bolshy, they're all competitively going off and doing their own thing in various different fields. You know, the biologists and the chemists and the physicists, they're all doing different things, a bit like a detective team looking at a crime scene and looking at the CCTV stuff, the forensic evidence, the criminal profiling. And separately, these scientists are coming back to one villain, CO2.